All right, everyone, welcome back from the break. Ending our break a little bit early at 11:30 instead of noon because our next presenter is able to accommodate our fast schedule this morning. Okay. So for our next presentation, we have Brandon Quirion on how deer shape forest ecosystems and promote the spread of invasive species. Brendan works as DEC's statewide big game biologist, focusing on white-tailed deer and black bear. Prior to working for DEC, he worked for the Adirondack Prism for 10 years, first as the Terrestrial Invasive Species Project Coordinator, and then as Program Director. He received his bachelor's degree in wildlife management from SUNY Cobleskill in 2010 and his master's degree in natural resource management from Cornell University in 2022. Brendan's experience and background in forest conservation and research give him special insight into the many challenges facing our forests and what we can do to help restore balance. So thank you, Brendan. We're really lucky to have you today. And if you'd like to share your slides, I will stop sharing now.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Abby and Cassidy. Again, my name is Brendan Quirion, and I'm the big game biologist for DEC out of our central office in Albany. And today I'm going to be talking about how deer shape forest ecosystems, and in particular, how they help promote the spread of invasive species. But I'm also going to be talking about some of these other impacts that deer have on our daily lives. Things like deer vehicle collisions, things like affecting farmers and their crops, and even promoting the spread and impacts of tick-borne diseases. And some of you have probably experienced some of these things. And so it really begs the question, how did we get to a point where deer are having such a dramatic impact on our lives and on our ecosystems? And that really requires us to kind of go back in time and understand the natural history of deer in New York and across the country, and also just get a better understanding of terrestrial ecology and how deer play a role in our ecosystems. So how did we get here? How did we get to this point where deer are such a major driver of these impacts to our ecosystems, to human health, and to our economy? So historically, we've had deer in balance with available habitat, and basic terrestrial ecology teaches us that most terrestrial ecosystems have what are called three trophic levels. At the bottom level, we have our plants, our primary producers. Up above that, we have our primary consumers, our herbivores. In this case, I'm going to be focusing on deer. And then above them, we have our predators. And historically, we had both a suite of apex predators, mountain lions, wolves, and us acting as subsistence hunters. And then we also had mesopredators on the landscape, species like bobcat and lynx, black bear. And then lastly, the other factor that's helped keep deer populations in check historically was our severe winters. So in areas of the Adirondacks and Catskills in particular, severe winters and deep snow would help keep deer populations in check because there would be a certain level of winter mortality that would occur. Now let's fast forward to the mid to late 1800s and early 1900s and the advent of unregulated market hunting. So during this period of time, large numbers of deer and other wildlife species were unregulatedly harvested, and that meat was primarily used for as a food source, or it was shipped down to more urban centers like New York City, where it was consumed there. And obviously, large numbers of deer were taken during this period of time, but other species were as well. You'll see in this photo here, there's a black bear in the photo, and I believe this might be a fox or a bobcat hanging up on the pole here. At the same time, there was tremendous changes in land use occurring. So much of our forests across the Northeast were cleared for either agriculture or the tanning industry. So on the left-hand photo here, you're seeing a photo of what this landscape looked like prior to reforestation. So primarily agriculture and denuded of trees. And then on the right here, this is actually a picture of a river where hemlock trunks are being floated down this river for the tanning industry. And so this combination of habitat destruction and unregulated market hunting resulted in extirpation of our apex predators across the Northeast. Wolves and mountain lions have both been extirpated from New York. And every once in a while, we get one that kind of meanders through New York, but we do not have established populations of these species at this time. And it wasn't until the advent of the Pittman-Robertson Act in 1937 that this began to change. And so I stole this cartoon from the Indiana Department of Natural Resources because I think it just gives a really good summary of how this current system works. So under the Pittman-Robertson Act, whenever hunters or really anyone purchases hunting-related equipment, ammo, and hunting licenses and stamps, there is an excise tax for the manufacturer, and they pay the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service 10 to 11% of that tax on that hunter equipment and ammo. That excise tax, or the funding generated from the excise tax, is then allocated to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to distribute to state agencies. And that is distributed based on the number of license sales that state agency sells each year and the land area of that state. And then ultimately, the state has to provide a certain level of match, typically about 25% match to the federal government for that funding that they receive through the Pittman-Robertson Act. And then lastly, that funding is what promotes much of the conservation work that state agencies do, both for game and non-game species. And so when this process started happening in 1937, state agencies began using that revenue to protect and preserve some of the species that were still on the landscape. Obviously, they couldn't do that for the ones that had been extirpated, but for species like deer that still had remnant populations across the Northeast, there were active efforts to reestablish and promote those populations. And this happened in New York. So we had remnant populations of deer in the Adirondacks and Catskills after their almost complete extirpation from New York. And there were active restoration efforts across the country. And those efforts resulted in the reestablishment of deer across much of the country. Now you can imagine what would happen when you reintroduce an herbivore into a system that no longer has apex predators and has all of this lush new forest growing up in those areas that had been cleared for agriculture and for the tanning industry. This was just a great situation for deer. They thrived in that type of environment where they had very little mortality from predators and abundant habitat to utilize. And so what you're going to see on this slide is the change in estimated deer density between 1982 and 2003. And so on the map on the left, the areas in green had low deer density, and then the areas in dark purple had high deer density. And this was the change that occurred just in the few decades or couple decades between 1982 and 2003. You can see there's a dramatic increase in deer density across much of the country. And this has continued to current day. And this has led to the advent of deer overabundance and the impacts that I talked about earlier. Things like deer vehicle collisions being more common than they used to be, agricultural damage being in the billions of dollars annually from deer across the country, the spread of tick-borne diseases and deer playing a role in that system. And even landscape and ornamental plant damage that occurs on residential properties. And just so you know that I'm not trying to exaggerate this, this was a story that came out just last year called "Fear the Deer: Crash Data Illuminates America's Deadliest Animal." And it was based on our study that found that deer are responsible for the deaths of about 440 of the estimated 458 Americans killed in physical confrontations with wildlife in an average year. So deer are more dangerous than grizzly bears. They're more dangerous than mountain lions and wolves, and they kill more people annually than any of those species. And that's probably something that most people don't realize. Okay, so let's go back to this depiction that I shared earlier. What I'm going to demonstrate now is what's called a trophic cascade. And what that means is when you perturb a certain level of an ecosystem, it can have these cascading effects down through or up through other levels of the ecosystem. And so the first change that we can influence here is we no longer have apex predators in the system. So when we removed apex predators from the system, there was less mortality on deer. Instead, we had coyotes recolonize, but they didn't have nearly as much of an impact on deer populations as wolves and mountain lions did. And this obviously led to deer population increases. And when deer populations increase, they exert increased browse pressure on vegetation. And so our vegetation communities were impacted by that. Next, we had subsistence hunting transition to regulated hunting. And the other primary source of human mortality was from deer vehicle collisions. But again, this was not nearly as much of an impact as subsistence hunting was on deer populations. And as a result, deer populations have increased. And again, increased deer browse pressure has affected our plant communities. And then lastly, we no longer experience those severe winters that we once did. It's been about 10 or 11 years now since we had a severe winter in New York State. And the amount of time between those severe winter events is increasing as a result of climate change. And so we can no longer rely on heavy snowfall or cold winter weather to help keep deer populations in check. And again, same trend here, deer populations can increase as a result of that and have increased browse pressure on our plant communities. Now, this makes it seem like we're losing our plant communities entirely. That's really not what's happening. It's a little bit more complex than that. And so I want to kind of just describe this process. And this is really where deer can promote and facilitate the spread of invasive species. So deer are keystone herbivores in our ecosystems, and they are preferential browsers. What that means is they tend to favor plants with high nutrients and high palatability, and they tend to avoid plants that have low nutrients and low palatability. And that's what you're seeing on the screen here. So this is just a depiction of a forest understory with deer in it and a variety of plants in it. The ones in green, I'm calling or have high nutrients and palatability. The ones in red have low nutrients and palatability. When deer populations are at low levels, you have a diversity of plants in the understory that are supporting deer, and deer aren't able to target any particular species or range of palatability because those native plants that are in the understory can withstand that browse pressure. When deer populations increase, it would make sense that the species that have the highest nutrients and highest palatability would be impacted the most first, because that browse pressure is targeted on them. And this is where you start to lose certain species from the ecosystem, things that are highly palatable. And again, as deer populations continue to increase, then you start to lose those species of moderate palatability. And eventually you can actually have species of low palatability and nutrition begin to expand into areas that are no longer occupied by those other species of plants. Sorry, I had an alarm come up on my phone. And so this is where you can have ecosystems really be dominated by invasive plants that are of low nutrition and low palatability to deer. Under the worst case situations, you can have so many deer on the landscape that nearly or hardly anything can grow in the understory. You have this almost vacant understory with maybe nothing but some mosses and grasses that deer just can't digest readily. And so what ends up happening is you see systems transition from having understories dominated by a diversity of plant species and ones that are highly preferred by deer, things like trillium, orchids, hemlock seedlings, yew, even oak seedlings. And they begin to transition to these species that are unpreferred by deer. Things like invasives, primarily invasives that have chemical defenses or some type of structural defense. So garlic mustard has a chemical defense that keeps it from being browsed by deer. Species like Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, and other invasives with thorns obviously aren't preferred by deer because they're difficult to eat because of those thorns. And you also see species like Japanese stiltgrass that has high lignin content begin to dominate because they're not easy to digest. Deer can't digest grasses and plant species with high lignin content very readily. You also see some other native species start to expand because they have the ability to tolerate deer browse pressure. So things like American beech that has the capacity to root sucker after being browsed by deer tends to expand. And Japanese maple is another one that tends to expand with increased deer browse pressure. The other thing that deer are able to do is disperse these species from areas that they feed in. And so whatever a deer feeds on, and if that species has seeds at the time of that browse event, those seeds end up in deer feces. And deer can move these species fairly long distances in their home range away from those original infestations. And so it's very common to walk along deer trails extending out from say a honeysuckle thicket or a buckthorn thicket and find those small honeysuckle plants or buckthorn plants beginning to spread from the infestation as a result of deer dispersing those seeds. And then lastly, deer play a really important role in nutrient cycling in our forests. So when they go out and feed in certain areas and come back to an area to bed during the day, they're depositing large amounts of feces and urine. And this changes the nutrient dynamics in that particular setting or system. And interestingly, invasive earthworms favor those types of conditions. So in areas where the soil is being a lot of nutrients are being deposited in the soil by deer, invasive earthworms tend to do better and can spread into those areas more readily. And so here are some examples of deer impacted forests and ecosystems. To an untrained eye, you might look at these systems and say, it's green, everything looks fine. But this is really a nightmare situation for all 6 of these photos. So at the top left, this is after a timber harvest, and all of those trunk sprouts or stump sprouts that would replace those trees that were harvested are being browsed down so much that that forest can no longer replace itself. In the top middle here, we have an understory almost completely dominated by Japanese barberry, primarily because deer have browsed everything else that would resist barberry. And barberry doesn't have any competition and can continue to spread because deer don't feed on it. Top right is a fern glade. Species like bracken fern, hay-scented fern tend to do well in high deer densities because, again, deer don't browse on fern, at least those 2 species of fern in particular. And then bottom left is kind of the worst case scenario that I was describing earlier, where the understory is almost completely devoid of anything besides some remnant grasses, and you can see straight through the understory with no other vegetation. Bottom middle is an example of what's called a deer browse line, where everything below 6 feet in height has been browsed down, and you can walk through it pretty readily. And same thing on bottom right, just in a different forest setting where you can actually see that browse line through the understory. So how do we know it's deer primarily? Well, there's been a variety of deer exclosures constructed across the state and country, where the only thing that has changed is whether deer are present. And you see the dramatic difference inside and outside the fence when deer have been removed from these systems. So each picture here is outside and inside the fence. Whoops. And you can go and see these yourselves. There's a variety of deer exposures on public lands throughout the state where you can go and see this amazing difference when deer are experimentally removed from a system. Now, I want to be clear that these are also artificial systems. We never want to remove deer entirely from a system because they are a keystone species. However, they do give us a very good sense of what would happen if we could reduce deer densities in these forest settings. And obviously, when a forest transitions to these non-native species or just has very little understory because of deer browse pressure, it has dramatic impacts on other species as well. Anything that needs food or shelter in the understory to make a living could be impacted by this. And there have been a variety of studies that have demonstrated the impact that excessive deer browse pressure has on small rodents, ground nesting birds, amphibians, and invertebrates. And this has led some to make the claim that deer are a bigger threat to our forests than climate change. In some cases, I agree with this. I've been to forests where it's very clear that deer are the primary driver of forest degradation, and in the near term, they're the more important threat to address. And it's also important to remember that this can have impacts on deer themselves. So when deer kind of eat themselves out of house and home in a forest and are, just attempting to access that vegetation just above head height, there's really nothing left for them to browse down below, and you do get a severe winter event, you can have pretty high winter mortality because deer starve to death. And we haven't experienced this for some time in New York, but if we were to get another severe winter in areas like the Hudson Valley or Catskills or even the Adirondacks, after the habitat has been degraded to this extent, you could expect a major die-off. This also has important implications for diseases that deer can transmit and spread. So we have one disease that's been affecting deer populations in New York recently called epizootic hemorrhagic disease, and another one that's on the way called chronic wasting disease. And when deer populations are so high that they are interacting with each other more often, diseases tend to spread like wildfire. This isn't something new. We just lived through this as part of the COVID pandemic. We all had to socially isolate and not be in contact with each other because diseases spread quicker when we are in close proximity to each other. And the same thing happens with deer. If you have a lot of deer in a small area, they will spread disease faster than if you have deer spread out across the landscape. And the other thing we've been noticing is changes in deer health. So one of our indexes of deer health is what we call antler beam diameter. And so for each deer that we check during the fall hunting season that's been harvested by a hunter, we measure the base of the antler and calculate the antler beam diameter. And this gives us a sense of overall health of that individual. Antlers are essentially a manifestation of excess nutrients. So if you have excess nutrients on the landscape, antler diameters will increase in size. If there's not enough nutrients on the landscape, they will decrease in size. And this is what we're seeing for all three age classes of deer, of bucks harvested by hunters in New York. So on the top left is all the 1.5-year-old bucks that have been checked since 2016 through 2023. And you can see that downward trend in antler beam. Same thing for 2.5-year-olds here, and also for bucks that are 3.5 or older at the bottom right. So this is concerning. We don't want deer to not have enough to eat, and obviously we don't want them to be having such a dramatic impact on our ecosystems that they can't feed themselves. So, the question that I have to face and that we all have to face is can we restore balance? And I always think about this quote when I look at this photo of inside and out of a deer exclosure. It's from Aldo Leopold, the father of wildlife management. He said, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends to do otherwise." And so obviously something is wrong here. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to see this photo and understand that something's wrong and we should do something about it. So what can we do about it? And the first thing we need to understand is how do we drive or manage deer populations effectively, and how can we drive deer populations down when necessary? And what I'm going to show you here is what's called a demography plot or demography diagram. What you're going to see is different age classes, their survival rates, and their fecundity rates. Deer populations, obviously, we have fawns that are born in the spring, both male and female. They have a certain probability of surviving to be adult deer. We consider a deer to be adults when they reach breeding age, typically around a year and a half old. And then those adults have a certain probability of surviving into the next year and the next age class. However, it's the females in the population that produce new offspring and that contribute to population growth. The interesting thing about white-tailed deer is that doe fawns, as young as 7 or 8 months of age, can become pregnant if they reach a certain size by their first breeding season. And so you have both these adult does and juvenile does contributing new offspring into the system each spring. And this is results in very dramatic population growth in habitats that can support that level of population growth. The important point here is that if we only remove a buck from the system, we're just removing that one individual from the population. However, if we remove females from the population, not only are we removing that individual, but we're removing all of their future offspring. And this has a much more dramatic effect on managing deer populations and driving deer populations down than harvesting bucks. And this is an important message for hunters in particular, because many hunters value being able to harvest bucks and bucks with large antlers. That really is meaningless from a population management standpoint. And so whenever we harvest a buck, we also need to be harvesting at least one antlerless deer from that system, if not more, to help keep deer populations in balance with available habitat. And so that's something that I'm encouraging all hunters to do through the presentations I give. Whenever you harvest a buck, you need to be harvesting at least one antlerless deer, if not more. Okay, so thinking about these two systems, both past and present, we can kind of use the process of elimination to figure out what we can do to address this imbalance that we currently have. I would argue that neither one of these systems is sustainable. Under the past scenario, deer were almost extirpated from New York State and the Northeast. Obviously, we want to avoid that. And under the present situation, deer have become so overabundant that they're having all of these impacts to our forest ecosystems, human health, our economy, and even to themselves. And so what can we manipulate in these systems to achieve balance? So using the process of elimination, obviously we can't rely on deer vehicle collisions. That would just be unethical, and it's not something that we can influence. We can no longer rely on winter severity to assist us in this. And so it really comes down to whether we can encourage recreational hunters, modern day recreational hunters, to act more like subsistence hunters in taking more deer per year and more antlerless deer, in particular, female deer per year, or can we reintroduce some of those apex predators back into the system to help keep deer populations at lower levels? Now, there's an important caveat with that last alternative, and I think it's best depicted or articulated in light of this photo here. So many of the areas in New York State where deer populations are the highest are also heavily urbanized. So areas like Long Island, the lower Hudson Valley, Western New York, areas around cities like Rochester and Buffalo look much more like this. And so the habitat has changed very dramatically to a point where apex predator reintroduction is really not even worthy of consideration. How would we be able to reintroduce apex predators into these systems given the level of urban development? They would either not be tolerated and probably be dispatched by those folks in those areas, or they would leave. They would leave these areas to seek out better habitat that could support them. So this is why DEC is not really considering apex predator reintroduction in most areas of the state where deer populations are high, because we don't expect it to be successful. So where do we go from here? We really need to think about, what does ecologically based deer management look like? And this has been an evolution that DEC has gone through over the past couple decades. We now consider impacts to forest regeneration first and foremost in our deer population management objective setting process. And we rely primarily on a paper by Miller and McGill in 2019 that evaluated what's called forest regeneration debt across the Northeast. So on the left-hand map here, you have the average number of seedlings per square meter. And on the right, you have the average number of saplings per square meter, with those areas in gray and orange not doing great as far as new seedlings and saplings coming into the system to replace those older trees and regenerate our forests. And so if you were just to look at the map on the left, you might say, it doesn't look so bad. We got a lot of seedlings coming into the system to replace those trees. But it's much more concerning when you look at the sapling stage. Essentially, those seedlings, those trees that are below a foot high or so, are not getting into the next size class, primarily because they're getting browsed down by deer and not getting above browse height or above a deer's head. And so much of the state is in a poor situation when it comes to forest regeneration, because we're not getting seedlings transitioning into the sapling stage. So this helps us identify where there's a problem, where there's a current need to address deer population growth. The next lens that we're looking at is a study by Martin Lesser et al. In 2019 that essentially evaluated, if we were able to reduce deer populations by a certain percentage, what we could expect in the level of change in seedling density. And so this is just a map from that study that modeled a 25% deer herd reduction. And so those areas in orange and red on this map demonstrate the areas that would have the greatest increase in seedling density resulting from reduced deer populations. And so these are the areas that we're really focusing on to try and reduce deer population growth across the state. The reason we don't have data, or this map doesn't show information for Long Island, is because we don't have good U.S. forest inventory data for much of Long Island. And then the last lens that we look through is through public opinion. And so we conduct surveys of the public every 5 to 10 years to assess whether they would like to see more, the same, or fewer deer based on their past experiences. And this ultimately gives us a population trajectory that we attempt to achieve in each wildlife management unit across the state. And the outcomes of that last process, which was conducted in, I think 2014, is depicted on this map. So the areas of the lower Hudson Valley and Long Island were attempting to decrease the deer population by at least 25% by 2030. Same for the area around the Finger Lakes region. And for the rest of the state, we're in this stay the same trajectory. Now you might say, that seems like it seems like, based on what you just shared, why would we not have more areas of the state where we need to decrease deer populations? It's because we also incorporate public opinion. If we were to just rely on the data from Martin and McGill and Martin Lesser, we probably would have more areas of the state that should be in that decreased trajectory. But the public still doesn't perceive this to be a major issue in most cases. And that's why I give a lot of presentations like this. It's part of my role to educate folks on the level of impact deer are having, and to help change that public perception so that we can do better to address deer populations in the areas where it's needed. So We also need to think about how can we encourage, equip, and empower hunters to act more like subsistence hunters. As I mentioned previously, many hunters value harvesting a buck and harvesting a buck with large antlers, and it has very little impact on addressing deer population growth. So I'm interested in encouraging new hunters, primarily hunters who are looking at hunting for different reasons, to become engaged. And this is a picture of my wife with the first deer she harvested a few years ago. The main reason she wanted to be a hunter was because she wanted to know where her food came from, and she wanted to better understand the role that society plays in managing our ecosystems. She wasn't interested in harvesting a buck with large antlers. She just wanted to better understand where her food comes from. She felt much better about harvesting a deer that had lived a good life out in the wild as opposed to eating meat bought at the grocery store where she had really no idea where that meat came from or the life that animal lived. And so I think there are more people out there that would gravitate to hunting for these types of reasons, for sustainable food, for ecological stewardship, for animal welfare concerns. More people, I think, would want to participate in hunting for those reasons. They may just not understand the role that hunting can play in achieving those objectives. We also need to consider how to promote the full utilization of venison to address food insecurity. We have a food insecurity issue in New York State, and venison could provide a potential solution. So we've been partnering with an organization called Feeding New York State that receives funding from the Department of Health and from DEC to essentially cover the processing costs of deer and venison donated by hunters. And each year they process about 50 to 70,000 pounds of venison and distribute it to the local food banks throughout New York for distribution to those in need. Now, 50 to 70,000 sounds like a lot, but there is a lot of opportunity to expand here. Each year, the funding that we provide and that Department of Health provides gets spent out entirely. And so if new funding were available, we expect that there could be much more venison donated each year and a much greater impact in addressing the food insecurity issues that our state faces. And so this is something we would love to see encouraged and promoted. And we're looking for ways to increase the funding available for venison donation programs across the state. We also need to empower landowners and communities to engage in active deer management on their properties. And we have a couple different programs available to landowners. One is our Deer Management Assistance Program. This is really meant to provide property-specific deer management. It gives additional antlerless deer tags for hunters on the property. There's a free application window that you have to apply for by August 1st. And there's a 3-year permit with annual reporting and renewal. So as long as you report on your permit each year under that 3-year window, you're automatically renewed for the next year. We also have deer damage permits. And so when deer are addressing crops or municipalities in acute ways, so the damage is happening now and it's severe, we can issue a deer damage permit, which provides opportunity for those deer to be taken outside of the hunting season and using techniques that are not associated with hunting. So things like baiting or shooting at night. These are essentially meant to address those really severe deer problems as soon as they start happening. And there's also a free application window with no deadline and annual application reporting requirement. I'll also mention that we have this community deer management guide on our website. So for communities that are interested in becoming involved in deer management, we provide guidance on how to go about implementing a deer management program in your community. I would encourage anyone to review that document and reach out if you have questions. And then lastly, we also need to promote the personal venison consumption for its ecological, animal welfare, and human health benefits. Venison is one of the most healthy meats available right now. I think bison is just above it as far as nutrient levels. But venison is extremely healthy. From an animal welfare standpoint, again, as I mentioned previously, I feel more comfortable, my wife feels more comfortable about harvesting a deer that lived a life out in the wild, as opposed to going and buying our meat at a grocery store and not knowing the life that animal lived and where it came from. And the ecological benefits too. If more of us were consuming venison on a daily basis, whether we're a hunter or not, you don't have to be a hunter to consume venison. You could have some given to you. Um, Obviously, there could be more hunters willing to take more deer each hunting season. So many of these things are articulated in our management plan for white-tailed deer in New York State, and I would encourage you to review this document. Its main objectives are population management, hunting and recreation, conflict and damage management, education and outreach, deer habitat, and operational resources. And I also want to mention that there are certain things that restrict DEC's ability from implementing more effective deer management and some of these strategies to address the problem that I just went over. And many of these pertain specifically to Long Island. These are all articulated in Appendix 8 of our current deer management plan. I'll go over some of the ones, but currently, firearms to take deer during the regular season in Suffolk and Westchester County is prohibited. You can only use bows only. This is just not efficient if you're wanting to remove more deer from the landscape or reduce the population. Firearms are a much more efficient tool to address that situation. We also don't have the ability to allow hunters to sell and receive compensation for venison. So if we want more people consuming venison, obviously, if we provide some incentive for hunters to take more antlerless deer and be able to sell it, that would help promote that. But we don't have any ability to do that right now because of an antiquated law that's in place. We also don't have the ability to regulate crossbow use throughout the entire state. Ideally, we would want to see crossbows be able to be used throughout the entire bow hunting season. But again, we lack that authority currently. Even certain areas of the state are closed to deer hunting. Areas of Nassau County, Albany, Erie, and Monroe counties, you can't hunt deer at all. So obviously, those are areas where deer populations have grown pretty much unabated, besides deer vehicle collisions, and it's just not a good situation given all the impacts that can cause. And lastly, down at the bottom here, DEC doesn't even have the ability to issue additional antlerless or female deer tags throughout much of the northern zone. So in areas of the Adirondacks where we're no longer experiencing severe winters like we once did, we don't really have many tools in our toolbox to help address those growing populations. And that's primarily because, again, an antiquated law took away DEC's authority to issue these deer management permits throughout much of the northern zone. So these are all things that we're trying to educate stakeholders on and encourage advocacy on, because without these restrictions being lifted, we are handicapped. Our hands are tied to some extent in being able to address the solution in more effective ways. And so, again, I would encourage you to review Appendix 8 of our deer management plan and consider some of the things that affect Long Island, and reach out to your legislators or your representatives about some of these things and encourage them to take up some of these policy items. So with that, I'll leave it there, but I really appreciate the opportunity to present today, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Brendan. I feel like I learned so much in that presentation, from seeing, that clear browse line on some of those trees, and also that, like, the grasses being left behind from just from the preference and the digestion abilities of deer. So thank you. I see somebody unmuted themselves. John Turner, do you have a question?
Yeah, I do. I was curious. You talked about apex predators, and I fully understand the difficulty of trying to reintroduce mountain lions or wolves. But coyotes are a slightly different animal, and we now know that coyotes have become somewhat established on Long Island. I'm wondering, to what extent can coyotes have a positive influence on controlling deer populations?
Yeah. So coyotes primarily target the very young, the weak, or old members of the deer population. And what that's referred to in wildlife management is compensatory mortality. Essentially, these are individuals that would have or were likely to die anyways, had a higher probability of death anyways. And so they don't really have much of an impact on maintaining or reducing deer populations as a result of that. They would need to be feeding on those adult females in particular to have much of a role, and that's why wolves and mountain lions had much more of a role.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
I have a question too. Oh, sorry, Dan, if you were about to say something, you can go ahead.
Just real quick, obviously DEC Region 2, we're in the city limits, so no hunting allowed, just similar to those other counties you mentioned. In Staten Island, especially where most of our property is located, could you speak to any options outside of hunting and I guess deer browse fences that are out there? Maybe kind of like catch and neuter programs, or I'm not quite sure what, but yeah, it's definitely a challenge where hunting is not allowed.
Yeah. So many communities implement intensive deer culling operations. So this is where trained sharpshooters or professionals come into a community and remove the deer strategically. That would fall under one of our deer damage permits. So, for example, the city of Ithaca does this annually to keep their deer populations at low levels. It's definitely expensive or more expensive than recreational hunting, but it's extremely effective. They were able to reduce their deer populations from a peak of about 110 per square mile down to 10 per square mile. So this is an opportunity for communities to still implement some type of lethal control, not using recreational hunting. As far as fertility control goes, there's ongoing research on fertility control, but as far as at this point, it's really only been effective or had demonstrated effectiveness in what are called closed populations. So island habitats or fenced-in habitats, primarily because deer immigrate into the system. So when you remove individuals or restrict reproduction in a particular area through fertility control, there's still new deer coming into the system each year from outside of that treatment area. And it's extremely costly and labor intensive to try and treat all of those individuals as they come into the system. And that's really been why it's been ineffective in open populations. So there's a couple ongoing research projects using new techniques for fertility control that DEC has permitted. But we're currently only allowing fertility control under a research license just because it hasn't had demonstrated effectiveness without being combined with some other lethal control.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we are doing some fertility controls, or somebody is on Staten Island, but I think people forget how good of swimmers deer can be. So I think they even come over from New Jersey still. So like you said, the populations just kind of continue to increase. And yeah, I don't think culling is also allowable. So it just creates more challenges for us. But thank you.
Any other questions in the chat?
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Go for it.
It's again, John Turner. Brendan, in your slide, it said legal restrictions and recommendations. I got distracted a second, but so I might have missed what you had said. But the first bullet point, you said allow firearms to take deer during the regular season in Suffolk and Westchester. That suggests that firearms cannot be used to take deer in Suffolk County. Is that
correct? Yeah, only so throughout the majority of the season, only bows can be used. There is a special January season on Long Island that allows firearms, but throughout the rest of the season, only bows can be used. And so allowing firearms throughout the entire season would be much more efficient than bows in helping to reduce deer populations.
right? That's why I was confused because I've seen deer hunters with guns, so I didn't quite understand that the first bullet point. Then thinking that it wasn't allowed at all. So what's the rationale for having this bifurcated approach? Why would the legislature consider legislation that would allow for firearms to be used in Suffolk County all the time?
I think it's when the laws were enacted, I think there was just concern over safety, public safety, but there really hasn't been much evidence that firearms or use of firearms is less safe.
Right.
New York has a very strong track record of hunting safety.
Right.
So, I think it's changing the perception of our or our representatives, and demonstrating that hunting with firearms can be safe and is more effective. And I hope that some would be willing to reconsider it.
Okay. Well, that's helpful to know. Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, Brendan, how safe are they to eat deer? They seem to be covered in ticks.
Can you repeat the first part of that question?
Every deer that I've ever seen that was killed is covered with ticks. And I was wondering how safe it is to eat them.
It's safe to consume deer that have ticks on them, but it's not a good life to live if you're being constantly covered in ticks. So one of the other things that happens when our forest ecosystems transition into kind of these invasive brushlands is tick abundances increase. Those species like honeysuckle and barberry provide ideal habitat for ticks, and the increased deer density in those areas and small rodent density in those areas also contributes to tick population growth. And so, you kind of have these vicious cycles that occur where deer start the process of transitioning an ecosystem, and then other species that are undesirable, like ticks, benefit from it.
And one other thing, I've had some good success with seedlings and saplings just by putting newspapers around them. I seem to have no more deers coming close to them.
That's an interesting approach that I haven't heard of before. So you're just wrapping the seedling in newspaper at the base?
Yeah, surrounding it so we don't get an undercover of invasive vines, and I don't have any attacks anymore on my seedlings and saplings.
Yeah, it's interesting. It might be just kind of a novelty where deer, notice that there's something weird about that plant or avoiding it, or there might be some residual smell from the newspaper. It's hard to say, but in most cases, we need to protect seedlings in some way when we plant them in areas with high deer density, or they will get browsed down and won't get above deer browse height. So various types of fencing are available for that, which are the most effective. And then there's also scent deterrents that can be somewhat effective, but I wouldn't rely on them fully.
Great. Any remaining questions? I feel like this is a great discussion. Well, if not, if people join this presentation late, it has been recorded and we will be posting it as early as next week. We did have to move it up because of how the timing worked today, but you'll be able to catch the beginning of it if you missed it.
All right. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Brendan.
Yeah, thank you.